Bloop. Welcome to what's kind of will be the last 11-minute lessons. We're kind of pivoting to something called timely topics because there's so much going on in the world that has people almost like self-shot. There's so much happening all the time, big things tied in with faith that we need a space to sometimes talk about those things, both from a faith perspective, from kind of a nuanced perspective, and where we can really listen to each other, to practice all those things we've been talking about for the past couple of years on reconciliation, on listening, respecting one another, learning from one another, that hopefully together we can model how we can sometimes change minds through relationships, sometimes realize that we may not be totally right on a subject. There may be another way to look at something, to model some of that discussion. So next week will be probably one of the harder ones on a positive and a negative, where people will be invited to share like a minute, something positive and something negative that the administration has done over the past since they've been in power. For some, it'll be hard to look for a negative because they only hear the positive side, you have to dig for it. For some, it's going to be hard to hear a positive because they're only hearing the negative side, you have to dig for it. My belief is if you can't find either, you're not trying, because you can look and you can find things. So I made a discipline to name several things on both sides. For me, one side's easier to find. For you, a different side may be easier to find. But we're going to talk about that, not debate it, but be able to listen and say, oh, I never considered that as a positive, or why it might be a positive to some. For others, say, ooh, I never realized that real world negative implication, but now it's staring me in the face because it has a name and it has a person I know and trust, and I didn't realize that they just lost their job or something like that. So you kind of can learn from each other. So we'll kind of just talk briefly, each people naming something, and having kind of a debrief about it. What did we hear? What are some commonalities? So we'll talk about that, and that'll lead to some other timely topics on a variety of issues. I have one on what does the Bible say about immigration, one on the order of love based on J.D. Vance's quote, one on what is free speech, looking at a case study through a Supreme Court case, Texas versus Johnson. Looking at some of these things so we can, as a church, gather and have kind of respectful discussions where we listen to one another and illustrate all those principles of reconciliation we've been talking about, all those principles of staying in the room with difference and being unusually interested in the other. So we're going to start that next week, and it'll be like twice a month on different topics as things come up, and we'll keep having our curious conversations. But today we're looking at the Beatitude, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So when you think about righteousness, righteous, what comes to mind when you hear that term, righteous or righteousness? This is where you get to participate in this study. What comes to mind with righteous or righteousness?
Doing the right thing.
Doing the right thing. What else?
I think, unfortunately, self-righteousness.
Self-righteousness.
The Pharisees,
Yeah.
kind of.
That's kind of how I think of it. Sometimes I hear the word, I automatically think of like, oh, I'm so great.
Yes.
I'm right and you're wrong. You puny people. And I know good people who really genuinely care about trying to do the right things, who might be on opposite sides of an issue, who are both like, ha-ha, and I was like, ha-ha, and they talk down and almost like dehumanize the other because they're so convinced they are right. And therefore they are righteous. And because they're in the position of righteousness, they can treat others poorly. That's often kind of the rhetoric we have. If I'm on the righteous side of something, I get to do things because it's for the sake of righteousness. So sometimes in our righteousness, we end up being very unrighteous. So righteous comes from the Hebrew word tzedakah, and it kind of has connotations of goodness, of generosity, of justice. But it always ties in to how we are in relationship with God and with each other. Righteousness is always about the relationship, not so much about the belief. So I've said it before the last couple of years and saying it more often, we need to practice holding relationships above beliefs. Because so often we get into this idea of, here is my right belief, I am now better than you. Or I hold this belief, you don't, We can't be friends anymore. We're going to end the relationship over the belief. And that pulls people farther and farther apart and tears the fabric of society. Relationships are really important to Jesus. Later in the Sermon on the Mount, he'll say, if you are going to the altar and you have your gift and you're about to offer it, if you're going to church, you got your little tithe notebook out and you're about to put it in the offering box, and you remember that a brother or a sister, and in this context, it's really if a neighbor, if someone in this society has a problem with you, there's a break in that relationship, stop, put your gift down, go and be reconciled, and then come back and offer your gift. For Jesus, this reconciling of relationships is more important than coming and offering your gift in worship. That if there are people who have issues with you, that needs to be fixed first. That's how important these relationships are. So righteousness is always tied with how we are treating one another, our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. So the Beatitudes says, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for those who are trying to hold those right relationships. Can you think of anybody, history to now, who you would say has been persecuted for righteousness' sake? The 8 a.m. people had examples, just going to let you know.
Martin Luther King.
That was one of the 8 o'clock answers, Martin Luther King Jr. Trying to say all people deserve equal protection under the law, equal opportunities. Let us live into these ideals that were expressed in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, and really all people should be created equal. Let's live into that. And he was persecuted for it, both being judged with suspicion from the FBI to being assassinated because he was changing the status quo, but in a way that made relationships better. Because if half the country says, I am fundamentally better than you, you are not a true person. And there's roots in that. Anybody remember the Supreme Court case of Dred Scott, right? I listened to somebody who said, the worst Supreme Court justice and the worst president both came from Dickinson College, and they felt bad about it. But so in the Supreme Court case, the Chief Justice writes that, of course, Dred Scott doesn't deserve to have freedom. He is a lesser person. He's not a real person. They don't deserve the same rights, the same opportunities, even come before the law as white people. Supreme Court case. So there is this history of saying we are better. That is not righteousness. That is not living in right relationship with one another. So Martin Luther King's trying to repair some of that, and is persecuted for it. Anybody else have somebody who's been persecuted for righteousness' sake? Nelson Mandela. Again, that same issue of we are full humans too. We deserve equal rights. The relationships we have with each other aren't right. Thrown in jail. It's funny though, when he comes back out of jail and becomes president, a lot of people really didn't like how he handled it, because they wanted him to have retribution against, the people who had been in power. But he knew that too wouldn't be righteousness. So even after he became president, in some ways he was persecuted for righteousness' sake, because he wasn't doing what some people wanted to do, is make them suffer like we suffered. But he knew it may be even what some people think the right thing to do, but it's not the righteous thing to do. You can be right in your beliefs and be unrighteous in your actions around those beliefs. And that's where I think too often we fall into these bad patterns of I am right, I am on the righteous side, therefore I can do this and that. One of the examples I think back several years ago that really illustrates how we can have different ideas of what's right and wrong, and then completely kind of almost be hypocritical in how it's enacted against somebody else. So at the same time, several years ago, it was right after the Obergefell Supreme Court decision that allows same-sex marriage. So there was a woman in Kentucky, a clerk of court named Kim something, and she refused to sign same-sex marriage certificates. So conservatives are saying, hey, she's being persecuted for what she believes is the righteous thing to do. She believes in her faith that this is wrong. She's being persecuted for that. And the liberals are like, oh no, she's a horrible person. She's not following the law. She should be punished. At the same time, there was a woman named Bree Newsom. She climbed the flagpole of a monument on the South Carolina state grounds to tear down a Confederate flag that was hanging there. She was arrested. Liberals are like, she should not be arrested. She was doing righteous actions. She was justified in this. And the conservatives are like, no, she broke the law. If you break the law, you go to jail. Do you see how both sides are appealing to the same kind of thing and forgetting the other side, but it's all about what they believe is righteous in that moment and how the law can fit with them and not there. Two things happening, two dialogues at the same time. When I tried to point that out to people, let's just say I was persecuted for righteousness' sake. Because we don't always want to hear it. It's difficult. And that's why it's really important that as a church we can gather and have some of these discussions of what is righteousness. When is it? Sometimes you may be persecuted for righteousness. The person I think of right now as being persecuted for righteousness' sake is my good friend Reverend David Latimer. If you remember him, he was persecuted. People sent him hate mail because he had the audacity to try to have a relationship with someone on the other side. Someone who did what they would consider very bad things. And even Martin McGuinness may have said, you know what, these were bad things, but I feel like I had to do them for the sake of righteousness. That's where it gets really tricky sometimes in moral ethics. Martin McGuinness may say, I didn't like to do these things, but I did them ultimately for righteousness. And the other side would say, that's never an excuse to do those bad things. But then they might do bad things for righteousness. It's tricky. Ethics is tricky. But David said, I'm going to befriend this person because I think we need to work together for peace. Because the only way we're going to have a better society in Northern Ireland is if we find ways to come together. And we're going to disagree on a lot of things, but when we like each other, the rules can change, and we may change hearts and minds, even if it's one little person at a time. And he was persecuted for it. Some people left the church. He got lots of hate mail. You can Google him and read articles about it and read the comments. They're not nice. But here's somebody in faith who says, I believe the righteous thing to do is to reach out in love and friendship. Because if God can use Paul, who committed acts of terrorism, if God can use David, who did a lot of shady things, why can't God use Martin and even our friendship? And that's where I think we lead with righteousness today. Are we willing to lead that righteous life of being in a right relationship with God and with each other, in humility, in justice, and love? And no one's going to get it right totally, because there are different definitions. You can look, and good philosophical people will argue different ways. Somebody brought up Bonhoeffer this morning. I said that'd be a good timely topic sometime, because everybody talks about a Bonhoeffer moment. Is there even such a thing? And the ethics of what Bonhoeffer did, if you're not familiar, tried to plot to assassinate Hitler. Is that right or is that wrong? There's not such an easy answer, but sometimes we pretend like it is. And so also having humility that what I may feel is righteous, somebody else may have a good claim to say it's not. And to think for a moment that maybe I might be wrong. There's a classic Peanuts cartoon strip in which Snoopy's at his typewriter and he's thinking things. He's writing a book on theology. And Charlie Brown asks, well, what's the title going to be? And Snoopy says the title is, Have You Ever Considered You Might Be Wrong? Which is really a great book for theology, but really a great motto for all of us when it comes to religion, when it comes to politics, when it comes to ethics or anything else. Have we considered we might be wrong? To do that while trying to remain faithful to your beliefs and your principles, that's hard work. But that's the work we're called to do. So as we go through this, we try to be righteous, having these right relationships, reaching out. We may be persecuted for it. You may be persecuted for standing up for someone you really care about and saying, this person is a full person too. They do not deserve to be erased. I will stand by them. You may get persecuted for it. You may get persecuted on the other side of something else. As long as you can say truthfully that I'm doing this out of my belief in God and my faith and can articulate that, that's when we have to really try to listen to each other and hear where maybe someone's definition of faith may be different from ours. Can we have those conversations? Because maybe there's true faith in both of that, and we're missing a little piece. Questions, comments, righteous remarks. So next week, we'll do our first Timely Topics on a positive and a negative. So you're invited to come and find something. Do the research. Name briefly a little explanation of what's one positive thing that has happened out of the current administration in the past several weeks. If that's hard for you, dig in. Try to find something. Other side, name something negative. If that's hard for you, dig in. Listen to other voices and discover what maybe could be a negative. And we're going to listen to each other and hopefully learn about each other and build some trust so we can have the important, faithful, and ethical conversations in here that we might not always walk away with, here's one answer, but here's some tools to help each of us better discover how we can be faithful to ourselves and to God and to our faith. So I hope you'll join me for a lot of those coming up. And I think it'll be hard work, but it's important work. Thank you all very much.